Even when I'm doing a private tutorial, I forget to unmute my microphone. How you doing, everybody? I thought I would create a quick supplementary tutorial for the worksheet. I've had a couple of people send me some frantic emails worried about being able to sort that whole thing out and to get a decent grade. First, I'm here to tell you that even if you bomb this assignment, you are not going to fail the class, and it is not going to drop your grade by 10 points. Okay. There's enough assignments, and the assignments are only a portion of your grade percentage that if you bomb one, it means you got to, look into those concepts and do a little more studying, but it's not going to kill your GPA. Okay, but let's talk about this worksheet because I don't want anybody losing any sleep over this. It's not that big of a deal, but it would be nice if the concept started to resonate with most of you, especially those of you who want to work in the camera department moving forward. So let me share my screen because I have the worksheet going on here, and put my little icon up here in the corner. And so let's take a look at this thing. All right, so here's the beastie right here. So the instructions are: fill out the empty boxes below with camera settings that will equate to a proper exposure. Use the baseline given to you as a confirmation of a correct exposure. Each line should represent a correct alternate set of solutions that also equal a correct exposure equal to that of the baseline. The goal is to create a new consistent set of exposures for a new set of shots that will avoid under or overexposure variances from solution to solution. In other words, can I pick a whole different set of variables and still have my picture come out properly balanced, not too bright, not too dark? Okay. The graphs on page 2 are there to help. I'll explain them a little bit more in detail here. And see if this will help some of you sort of power through this thing. Okay, so here are our, 8 questions, okay, 2 through 9, okay, and we have a baseline up here. This is line 1 is the baseline. Okay, I don't know what this image is. It's an imaginary image. Don't worry about what the image is. It doesn't really matter. What matters is these were the things that had to be dialed into the camera in order to make that image look properly balanced, not too dark and not too bright. Okay. So we call that a baseline, and every change or variation on the baseline that we're going to make has to also balance out to a correct exposure. Okay, and I'm going to show you how to do that. All right, so what we want to do is we want to take a look at these different sets of exposures here, and we just want to figure out what we can plug in as an alternate to what might have been listed or what might have changed. If we take a look at our second line down, it's called example. And in the example, something on this line changed from the baseline, okay? So in the first column, I have ND filters. So remember, ND filters are like sunglasses for your lens. So an ND filter is going to represent some modicum of exposure control. So here's an ND3 filter, which is also, you might also refer to this as an ND2X or an ND2. Okay, it's a one-stop reduction filter. Okay, it's a neutral density filter that when put in front of the lens, it's going to reduce the exposure by 1 f-stop. It's going to make the image darker. Okay, if you're in a bright location and you need to make the image darker, but you don't want to use camera controls, you want to use filters to do it, you need sunglasses, you need an ND filter. Okay, I can give you a quick example of how this works. Let me show you, for instance, I've got a light meter here, okay? And I've got an ND3 filter, okay? And I've got a lamp over my dining room table, which is where I'm sitting right now. If you look at my meter, you'll see there's some information on the readout. Okay. So what we've got here is we've got ISO dialed into the light meter. Okay. In class, I talked to you about ISOs and how they are really just trying to describe the sensitivity state of our camera or our capture device specifically. Okay. I also talked to you about something called a native ISO. Okay. Let's say I have a Blackmagic cinema camera, kind of like the ones that we use in cinematography too, at UCF in the film studio. Let's say I've got an Ursa Mini 4.6K and I want to shoot something on stage. And so the manufacturer's recommended native ISO for that camera, actually for that camera, I believe it's 400 ISO, but let's pretend it's 800 ISO, or let's say I have the new version, the G2 version of that camera, the Pro version, which is a native 800 ISO camera. So I put 800 into my light meter, right? I entered that into the meter as part of the calculus that this little device is going to make when it tells me how much light I have and what f-stops to use on my lens. Okay. So here's ISO 800. It's dialed into the meter. Down here, I have my 24 frames per second condition also entered into the meter. So the meter now has two pieces of information that I have given it that it's going to use in its calculation matrix to figure out what f-stops I need to put on my cinema lens. Okay. Now I've got a value entered here because I tested the meter and I pushed my read button. Okay. On the side of the meter, I've got a button. When I push it, it takes a meter reading, and the meter looks at essentially light coming through this lumisphere right here, which is nothing more than a plastic ball with a photosensitive. Oh, I can't take this one off. There's a photosensitive diode behind this little lumisphere. Okay. And when light hits the lumisphere and it radiates through the plastic, the white plastic, the light that makes it through the plastic and hits the little diode in there creates the interaction that then allows the meter to detect the volume of light in the room or coming out of my light source. And then it makes a recommendation of how to set my f-stop on my cinema lens. That's essentially how a light meter is working. Okay. It's really nothing more than that. How you use this meter and the way that you take meter readings, yes, can have a great deal of difference in the way your exposures look. But for the sake of this demonstration, let's just say I'm going to use it in the basic way, right? And I'm gonna take a quick example of an exposure. Okay, so I've got a light over my dining room table. It's kind of acting like a fill light. If you can see as I block it off my face, you can kind of see how I should turn it off. The shape is better, but it's filling in all of the shadows, right? And so I kind of have a light source coming from this direction, which is sort of acting like a key light because it's creating the shape from side to side that is lighting my face. Okay. If I stick my meter in here and I take a reading at ISO 800 and 24 frames per second, and I tell my meter to read, it'll tell me basically what aperture I've got to use on my cinema lens in order to get the proper balance of exposure using these other two variables of the exposure triangle to fulfill my exposure solution. 284, okay? 284, that means 2.8.5, midway between a 2.8 and a 4 on my cinema lens. And if I had to show you, I got my 85 millimeter here because it's got a nice big front element on it, and you can see that aperture change really easily, especially on camera. Okay. So on my f-stop ring, where is it? Okay, 2, right? F2.8 kind of looks like that. F4 is smaller. It's like that, right? But if my meter tells me to go in between, then what I got to do is set the lens somewhere in between 2.8 and 4, right? And I get an aperture size that's roughly that big. Okay. Now, that's all well and good. But let's say I don't want to shoot it at 2.8.5. I want to open my lens even wider. Why? Because I'll get shallower depth of field. I'll get a nice sort of nice plane of focus here at my eye, but the background behind me will go out of focus more. The foreground, anything in the foreground will be out of focus, just like we talked about in class. So I might take a neutral density filter, a one-stop reduction filter, and if I hold it in front of my meter and take another reading, two and a third. Well, 2 1/3, 2.0 and 3/10 and 2.8 and 4/10 is essentially one stop difference. Okay. But look what happened. Now I'm at a 2 and something tenths, and I was at a 2.8 and something tenths before, right? So now, instead of being at a 2.8 on my cinema lens, I've added that neutral density filter, and now I have to open my iris even more to accommodate what I did here and keep the balance. Okay. But the trade-off was I got to use an even bigger lens opening, which meant I got to decrease my zone of focus and get stuff more out of focus in the background and more out of focus in the foreground, and limit how much is actually sharp to my plane of focus, which would be on my eyes or my glasses. Okay. So if you have if you have an actress or somebody that's delivering a really powerful line in a dramatic piece, and you don't want the audience's eyes to be over here or over here looking at stuff that they really shouldn't be thinking about, you want them to be focused right in here and wait for the line that's going to reveal the thing that they've been sitting in the theater for 2 hours waiting to understand. Bang. You want to create the focal point by having the background out of focus and the foreground out of focus, right? Okay, so that's what we're doing when we control the exposure and we make these choices in the first place. But for the sake of talking about an ND filter, all we're doing is adding something in front of the lens that makes the situation darker, and then we have to recalculate. Well, I got a light meter to help me with that project of recalculating. I don't have to work it out on paper. I use a light meter. But it's important that you understand what's happening, what the light meter is doing, so that this makes sense when you are, let's say it's the night before and you're pacing the room or your office and you're worried about how you're going to attack an exposure problem the next day on set when you have all these things going on, and you want to make some plans and think about what's going on. You can make manual calculations and things in pre-production or the night before that'll help you anticipate exposure problems on the day, if you know how to do the math and do the swap the filters and use the light meter. So this worksheet is really exploring that kind of problem management, but just on a really simple pseudo mathematical scale. We're really not doing any calculating. We're just counting jumps on a chart. So if I go back to my screen share and take you to the worksheet, here it is. Okay. So in our example, okay, we had neutral densities piled into the camera that equated to 1/16. Okay. We had an f-stop working at a T4, and we had a sensitivity dialed into our camera as the native ISO 800. Our shutter was 1/48 because our frame rate was 24 frames a second. Okay. Now, all of these examples are 1/48. And so that value on a manual cinema camera can be locked in. That shutter speed can stay the same by virtue of the secondary shutter that's working inside the camera. The primary shutter is the rotating mirror, where we can change the angle of it and to change the effective shutter speed of our camera. The secondary shutter happens after that, and it's merely there to protect light or debris from entering the lens port while the film is being transported through the gate. Okay, but we can lock that value in. We could lock the cinema camera in at 1/48. Okay, and we have frames per second things that can happen over here that we can change, and they will affect our exposure. So frames per second, if I move my little, you can see frame rate is right here. Okay, so frames per second, shutter, which is going to be locked in, ISO, which we can change, f-stops, which we can change, and neutral density, which we can change. Okay, so if I go to number 2, okay, and I look at, okay, first of all, what are we asking for on the worksheet? It's asking for an f-stop. Okay. Something has changed, and it looks like, nope, not yes, the ISO has changed. Here we are, we're on line 2. So the ISO has gone to 3200 from 800. That means something. We locked in the value 1/48, so that's fine. But this also changed. This frame rate is now 12 frames per second. So we have to take that into account as well. Now, I did talk about this in the lecture. Many of you might have missed it, blink and you'll miss it kind of thing. But we talked about 24 frames per second as the shutter is opening and closing. What does that mean? Well, it means that mechanisms are opening a gate and light is being allowed to pass through the whole system, the lens and the lens port on the camera, the gate on the camera, the rotating shutter, and bang, it hits your recording media, whatever it is, film or a sensor. Okay. And that's when the exposure is happening. Okay. And at 24 frames per second and 1/48, that shutter is open for a predetermined amount of time, right? So let's say the interval is just 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But then we change that interval and we go to half that speed. 1, 1000, 2, 1000, 1, 1000, 2, 1000. More light is passing through that system, right, than it was a moment ago at the other frame rate. If your shutter speed, or your frame rate is cut in half, that means your effective shutter angle is going to get wider, and therefore more light is going to hit your sensor, and it will do that in proportion. So half of 24 is 12. That's kind of like making an f-stop jump on the jump chart or an ISO jump on the jump chart from one value to the next. Okay, so at 24p, we have a certain amount of light coming through the system. At 12p, we have twice as much light coming through the system because the system is open twice as long. Okay, and then the opposite is also true. At 48 frames a second, the system is opening and closing much faster to accommodate a higher frame rate. Okay, so the gate in the whole system is open for half as much time, and therefore this represents a reduction in exposure. This can represent overexposure because it's extra light coming through, and this can represent underexposure because there's half as much light coming through, right? So frame rates work kind of the same way as these other values do. So let's look at those jump charts really quick. ISO 800, here we are, all right? We dialed that into the meter. We also dialed in 24 frames per second, which equals 1/48 and 180-degree shutter. I took a meter reading of my light over here, and it told me 2.8. And then I put my filter in front of my meter, and I took that reading again, and it told me 2. That's how I know that this filter is only an ND3, even if it wasn't marked. Tiffin marks them in the upper right corner or left corner, I guess. So you know what that filter is. But let's say after years of using it and cleaning it, I rubbed the label right off. And so the only thing I could do is kind of look at it and say, it looks like a neutral density 3, but let's just check it with the meter, okay? Without the filter, I've got a 2.8 coming out of my lamp over the table. With the filter in place, it's now a 2. So I know by verifying with my meter that this only reduced the exposure by 1 f-stop. Okay, but if you look at the chart doesn't lie. I was at a 2.8 without the filter. I added the filter. I had to go to a 2. That's a 1 jump on the chart. Therefore, it's a 1-stop correction filter. And because the filter made the image darker, requiring me to open the f-stop wider, this is an exposure reducing filter. Okay. So by adding the filter, I would underexpose my image unless I adjusted my lens to an f or T2 to accommodate what's happening through the filter. All right. So every time you jump 1, 2, 3, every time you jump from one value to the next, it represents an f-stop of reduction or increase in exposure. If I was at a 5.6 and I changed, for whatever reason, I changed my lens aperture to a 4, that's a one-stop overexposure if nothing changes at all. If I was at a 5.6 because that was what the environment was called for, right? My ISO at 800 and my frame rate at 24p. My shutter speed is 1/48. I use my light meter. The light meter says a 5.6. Okay. So I set my camera to all of those settings, right? And then I look at my external monitor, which I have on set sitting next to the director. And we look at the image and the director says, I don't know, it feels a little dark to me. And I'll say, well, I just set the camera according to what the meter said and the filters we're using and so forth. But we can open the lens up one f-stop and see what it looks like. And we go from a 5.6 to a 4, and then all of a sudden the image looks brighter because everything else stayed the same, but I opened the lens a little bit more to see what would happen. And it made the image a little bit brighter by one jump, one f-stop, brighter, because all I did is open the lens to let more light through. Okay. You can do that if you look at the images on your monitor on set, and if you feel like they're too dark, I mean, just because the light meter says the appropriate balance for exposure is X, whatever it shows me here, doesn't mean I got to use that information, right? If I look at the image and I determine that the image is still too dark for my taste, I can change the settings. I just need to understand what's going to happen when I do. And so if I open up to a 4 from a 5.6, I've overexposed the image by one full f-stop. And maybe I like that better, and that's okay. All right. But sometimes one f-stop can be can create a lot of trouble in the right situations, like outside at the beach. You open up the lens one f-stop arbitrarily and you're going to make things too bright. So the control has a lot to do with the environment you're in and the situation you're trying to expose for. But that's how these charts are working at ASA 800. All right, let's do it again. ISO 800 on my meter up here, 24 frames per second. And I'm going to just take a meter reading of the lamp over my dining room table and let's see what we get here. Let's see. I'm looking for something nice and beefy I can work with here. Like a 4. That's good. All right. So I got a 4 just behind my laptop coming out of the lamp over the table. All right. But I'm going to show you something. Let me show you how this can change. I think I have another ISO. ISO number 1. Oh, ISO number 2. Let's change ISO number 2 to 400. Okay. So at ISO 800, the exposure coming out of my dining room lamp is a T4. But at ISO 400, the exposure is a 2.8. Okay. Why? Well, at ISO 400, what did I do to the camera? I told the camera it was less sensitive than it was a moment ago. At ISO 800, it was functioning at what the manufacturer recommended as its optimal energy state for the capture device. But I decided, for whatever reason, maybe I want less noise in the image. So I said to myself, let's change the ISO of the camera to 400. But in doing so, I'm basically telling the camera, you're now less sensitive. You're in fact half as sensitive as you were a moment ago. And now there's less, you have affected your exposure in a way that it simulates less light available to the camera. And if there's less light available than there was a moment ago, and I continue to shoot at ISO or at T4 at ISO 400, my images will be underexposed because I told the camera you are now half as sensitive as you were a minute ago. So to counteract that ISO, we open up our lens by 1 f-stop because 400 is half of 800. So that's 1 f-stop. So if I go to 400 ISO and there is now allegedly less light in the room, then that would seem to indicate that at 400 ISO, I can't shoot at a 4, I have to shoot at a 2.8. So I open my lens to a 2.8, given the new ISO rating of 400. Okay. Now, sometimes you might lower your ISO without changing your f-stop. Why? Maybe you don't have an exposure reduction filter available. If you don't have any ND filters and you are shooting outside during the day and the camera says at ISO 800, you know, you have too much light. The camera is too sensitive to shoot out here with all this light going on. So what you could do is if you take your lens and you crank that iris all the way down to its smallest available size, and that's still not enough, the image still looks too bright to you in your monitor, you might start lowering the ISO, make the camera less sensitive, okay? So that you can either get a good exposure at this tiny aperture, or you can use a reasonable aperture with a nice amount of depth of field, a practical amount of image that's out of focus in the background and out of focus in the foreground, and then just keep reducing the sensitivity of the camera until something nice starts appearing on the monitor. And to do that, you could simply start lowering the ISOs of the camera to something like, in this chart, we have ISO 800 here. If we jump down 1 f-stop to 400, the image will start to have better density. If we jump another f-stop down to 200, now we're really bringing the extra light under control. And if we go all the way down to 100, that's 3 f-stops that we've reduced the exposure in the camera simply by telling the camera to make the chip less and less sensitive. In other words, send less and less current to the chip to activate it when we create an exposure. Okay. So that's the other way that we can darken our images if they're too bright. Just simply start lowering the ISO. Everything else can stay the same if all you want to do is make an arbitrary darkening of the image to make it look better to your eye. Or the other reverse is also true if you want to make the image brighter so it looks better to your eye. Okay, but every time you jump one direction or the other, you're either increasing exposure or decreasing exposure. And this chart, the ISO chart, works the same way as the f-stop chart. And it also works the same way on the neutral density chart. It's just that this chart reads differently. Okay, so this chart reads horizontally, okay, left to right and right to left, depending on what you want. And so does the ISO chart. And the ND chart, here it comes with all these numbers and confusing looking columns, and everybody starts freaking out. But if I did something really quick to this chart, if I were to say, let's edit my PDF and let me introduce something to this let me just highlight. Yeah, let's do that. Let me just highlight the stuff we want to use and don't look at anything else. So I think we want to think about ND2 filters. And I think we want to think about ND4 filters. Whoops, can I do that? I think I can. Maybe I can do the highlighter without. I can. And we want to think about ND8 filters. Stop it. Oh, come on, folks. Can I just, I've gone and made matters worse, probably. Stop it. Come on, man. All right, let's do this. Edit PDF. Do another. Here we go. I want to use these 3 and maybe ND16. That's a pretty good assortment. If I just look at this part of the chart right here, okay, and I don't pay attention to the rest of this because this is getting into some really specialized cinematography. We don't have to worry about it at this level. So really all I want to look at is this part of the chart right here. I can even ignore this last column, fractional transmittance, right? Who wants to talk about that? Percentage of transmittance, this kind of makes sense if you want to think about it a little bit, but really all you need to know is in the first column or the third column in terms of what to call the filter, either ND2 or ND.3. Okay, I told you the cinema guys like to call these ND.3s or ND3, right? Which makes it even more confusing, I suppose. But all it is a one-stop reduction. ND2 means twice the ISO, right? Or half the ISO in this case. Lens area opening as a fraction of the complete lens. Ugh, that's a fancy way of saying when you put this filter ND2 on the lens, half as much light passes through as it did before. Okay. So that's really the important column here. And what are you going to, which one are you going to use? The name is here and the reduction in exposure is here. Everything else, and then it'll literally spell it out for you. This filter with half as much light passing through is a 1-stop reduction or 2-stop reduction or 3-stop reduction or 4-stop reduction. Okay. That's literally telling you how many stops to subtract from your exposure solution. That's all that's happening here. All the rest of this stuff, just ignore it. Okay. And we don't really have to use this chart on the worksheet in its current state. I've simplified the worksheet to where shutter angles are no longer part of the solution options that you have to deal with. Okay, so if we go back and look at page 1 again, we have a situation in example number 2 where the ISO became 3200. Well, now you know how to deal with that. The baseline was 800 and now we're at 3200. Go back to your jump chart. The baseline was 800. Now we're at 3200. And what does it say right over it? Higher numbers make the camera more sensitive to light. So you went from 800 to 3200. You made the camera more sensitive. More sensitive means it needs less light to make an exposure. So let's go back up to the worksheet. All right. It was 800. Now it's 3200. Okay. If I were to put a note right here, I might say to myself, that represents +2. In other words, 1 jump, 2 jumps. And because I made the camera more sensitive, I need half as much light, half as much again. That's 2 stops of overexposure. And I'm going to do one, but I'm going to make this red so I can really see it against the rest of the document. Okay. All right. So we know that this is 2 stops over exposure, and we got to do something to counteract that. This stays the same. This stays the same. ND filters stayed the same. They want an aperture. Uh-oh. We're also at a different frame rate. Okay. Normal frame rate is 24 frames. Now it's 12. What happened? The film, if you can think about it in terms of a film camera, this is where this part helps a lot. If the film was going through at 24 frames a second, and now it's going through at 12 frames a second, that means the light is hitting the film for a longer duration. If it's hitting the film for a longer duration, that sounds like it's making the image brighter. The more light, the brighter the image. So that sounds like overexposure to me. So maybe we look at this and go, yeah, 12 is half of 24. This is a 1-stop increase in exposure. It's overexposed by 1 f-stop. So let's put another note here and call it +1. There we go. All right, now we look at it all the way across. Solution number 2. This is the same. This is the same. This has been adjusted. It's +1 and this is +2. So now that means +1 plus +2 is +3 total overexposure. Ouch, what happened there? All right, the total image is 3 stops overexposed overall. So if the original aperture was a 4, where's my 85 millimeter lens? This is going to help. Watch this. If my original exposure was a 4, let's set that there. All right, at a 4, we got an opening about that big. It's letting, you know, some amount of light through that was balanced for the baseline, but now the camera's more sensitive, which means this amount of light that's coming through is too much. How much? 3 stops too much. Okay, well, then what do we got to do? Logic would tell you if this is too much light coming through that little hole in there, the hole's got to get smaller to accommodate the excess of light coming through. So we're at a 4. Our jumps are +3 overexposure. So let's go 1, 2, 3. Now look at the size of the opening in the lens. It's really small now, right? Because that was the adjustment that had to be made to accommodate the extra light that was coming through if the camera was made more sensitive, right? That's exposure balance. And now if you look at the jump chart, it kind of makes sense because it's showing you the same thing, just graphically. So we were at a 4. Here's 4 right here, right? We were at a 4 and we had to jump 3 times because it was 3 stops overexposed, 3 times, 3 jumps towards darker. Well, darker is to the left on this particular chart. So 4, 1 jump, 5, 6, 2 jumps, 8, 3 jumps, 11. Are we at 11? Yes, we are. We're at 11. Okay. That's how these charts are working. Okay. So remember I told you the exposure triangle is relying on 3 concrete variables. And then I told you about a 4th. Okay. So what do we want to do with the exposure triangle in order to make this an easy day of it out shooting at the beach? Well, we want to shoot at 24p so we can record dialogue. So that gets locked in. That means 1/48 and 24 frames per second locked in, right? Then we want to use our manufacturer's recommended ISO, the native ISO, lock that value in, whatever it is. Okay. With this camera, I think it's like 400. With the Ursa Mini Pro G2, it's 800. My demonstration here, I used 800. Okay. Lock it in. Then it doesn't have to change unless you want it to. But if you don't want it to, lock it in. Now all you're doing is changing f-stops or adding filters. Okay. You add these to make your image darker if you got too much light already happening. And you change these by opening and closing to balance the amount of light. And usually you open wider when you've got less light available. Okay. That's strictly for exposure control. The depth of field question having to do with the size of this opening is another consideration. But if depth of field is not an immediate concern of yours, like if you're shooting volleyball at the beach, right? You probably don't want shallow depth of focus on a lot of it because you might not get the focus correct. The action's happening so quickly, and at smaller apertures, you get more depth of field. So if your focus is slightly off because your subject is moving, attacking the net, let's say, or serving, you know, you've got a little bit of zone of forgiveness there in terms of your focus. And so it's, you know, on a bright sunny day at the beach when you're shooting volleyball, Might be okay to have a smaller f-stop going on with more depth of field, offering you a better chance at getting your focus accurate. Okay. But when you're in a dark parlor in a, in an art directed turn of the century mansion with two lovers talking on the sofa, and one of them is proposing to the other, and all of the dialogue is very romantic and dramatic, you don't want people looking at the wall coverings and the paintings on the wall and the silver on the cabinet and the dishes on the table. You want them to look only at your subjects and ignore everything else. So you create a focal point at your plane of focus, your main subject delivering your important dialogue, and you push everything else out of focus using your depth of field tools, your f-stops, and your low ISOs. Okay, that's creative control. So there's two different ways to think about this: creative control, or simply managing your exposure to keep it from getting too bright or too dark. Okay, I don't want to do all these solutions for you, because then you won't get any practice on your own. But I hope that this explanation has helped. So what f-stop do we want to put in here? I think we figured that out. I think the answer was 11, right? So the answer for number 2 is F or T 11. Okay. That's how the worksheet works. Okay. I hope this helps. If not, and you're still having trouble, send me an email and I'll see if I can address it. Okay. That's all I've got for you. Thanks for your time. I hope this helps, and I look forward to talking to you all again next week. So thanks so much, and have a good weekend. Enjoy your evening.